Chapter 1. The Ultimatum. The fluorescent lights of the Prime Minister's office in Ottawa hummed, casting a sterile glow on Justin Trudeau's face, their artificial brightness doing little to mask the shadows of tension creeping into his features. His eyes, usually radiating youthful optimism, were clouded with a steely resolve, his jaw set, his fingers clenched tightly around the phone, the cold plastic digging into his palm. This wasn't a diplomatic call, it was a battle of wills, and Trudeau knew it. The economy was reeling, supply chains strained, industries panicking, and now he was forced to make a move that could either strengthen his position or push Canada further into the abyss of economic uncertainty. On the other end of the line, the voice, unmistakable even through the slight distortion of the speaker, boomed with its familiar cadence, commanding, confident, carrying the weight of a man who never negotiated from a position of weakness. Donald, with all due respect, this trade war you initiated has put Canada in an impossible position. I'm suspending the electricity surcharge to the U.S., effective immediately. A beat of silence followed, thick with tension, calculation, power dynamics shifting in real time. Trudeau could hear the measured breath on the other end, the way Trump took in the words, rolled them over in his mind, weighing their significance like a dealer scrutinizing the bets at a high-stakes poker table. Then, at last, Trump spoke, his voice smooth as polished marble, yet edged with steel. Justin, you're playing a dangerous game." The words dripped with a blend of amusement and warning, as if he were watching a younger businessman attempt to bluff his way through a negotiation he wasn't fully prepared for. "Remember who your biggest customer is. Remember who provides security. This isn't the way to get my attention. Believe me." Trudeau gritted his teeth, his grip on the receiver tightening, his mind racing through scenarios, counterattacks, alternative plays. He knew Trump's tactics, had studied them, had prepared for this moment. But knowing Trump and standing up to him were two different things entirely. The game had begun, and there was no turning back now. Trudeau pressed on, his voice rising in pitch, the frustration boiling over despite his best efforts to keep it measured. "Canadians are struggling, Donald," he snapped, his knuckles whitening around the receiver, his pulse pounding in his ears. "Our industries are hurting. You want to play hardball? Fine. You provide Americans with electricity. You take care of those who suddenly find their grocery shelves bare because our exports are drastically reduced." His breath hitched, but he pushed forward, his anger sharpening his words like steel against flint. "You started this mess, Donald. Now you deal with the fallout." A pause. Silence stretched, thick and unbearable, the weight of it sinking into Trudeau's chest. And then Trump chuckled, a low rumble, a sound so infuriatingly amused that it sent a shiver down Trudeau's spine, igniting a flash of panic deep in his gut. "You think this hurts me, Justin?" Trump finally said, his voice smooth as velvet yet laced with condescension, as though he were entertaining a petulant child rather than a world leader. "This gesture is a mosquito bite." Trudeau's stomach tightened, the hairs on the back of his neck rising, because he knew Trump wasn't bluffing, knew that when the President of the United States laughed in the middle of a standoff, it was because he was already planning his next move, already several steps ahead, and then the final blow. "But let me tell you, Justin," Trump continued, his voice dropping lower, more dangerous, more deliberate, "I am not known to accept ultimatums, especially when they are from a weak leader." The words hung in the air like a guillotine blade, and in that moment, Trudeau understood exactly what he had stepped into. He had expected resistance, had expected tough talk, had expected negotiations filled with fire and bluster. But this was something else entirely. He had challenged Trump directly, and now the game had escalated to a level he wasn't certain he was ready for. The next move would define everything. Chapter 2. White House Strategy. Within the West Wing, a crisis meeting was underway, the air in the Situation Room thick with urgency, the tension palpable as President Donald Trump sat at the head of the table, his gaze sweeping across the faces of his closest advisors. This wasn't just another diplomatic standoff. This was a direct challenge, and Trump was not the kind of man to take a challenge lightly. Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, stood at attention, her face pale but determined, knowing full well that her job in the coming hours would be to control the media narrative before it spiraled out of control. Beside her sat Stephen Miller, the deputy chief of staff, his expression unreadable, his fingers steepled together as he listened, his mind already formulating possible responses, already calculating the counterstrike before the first move had even fully landed. "Trudeau thinks he can bully us," Trump declared, his voice resonating with barely contained fury, the raw intensity of his anger vibrating through the room. He thinks he can cut off the lights and starve Americans into submission. He's wrong, dead wrong. The words carried weight, not just because they came from the president, but because everyone in the room knew that Trump did not bluff. Caroline was the first to speak, her tone measured but urgent, her eyes flicking between Trump and the senior advisors seated around the table. Mr. President, the media is already painting this as a major crisis. They're saying the energy grid is vulnerable, the economy is at risk. We need to control the narrative before panic sets in. She had spent the last 2 years battling an openly hostile press, and she knew that if they lost control of the story, they would be fighting an uphill battle not just against Canada, but against the media industrial complex, determined to paint Trump as reckless, as unstable, as incapable of handling an international crisis. Miller, his voice flat and precise, leaned forward, his hands still clasped tightly together, his words measured, deliberate, calculated. We have options, Mr. President. We can impose further tariffs, target key Canadian industries. We can squeeze them until they beg for mercy. His tone held no emotion, only strategy, as though he were discussing a chess match rather than an economic confrontation that could have global ramifications. If Trudeau wants to play hardball, we show him that the United States doesn't negotiate from a position of weakness. Trump leaned back in his chair, his mind racing, his hands drumming against the polished table as he absorbed their words, weighing his next move. He had played this game before, had watched world leaders underestimate him time and time again, only for them to find themselves back at the table, heads lowered, deals renegotiated on his terms. He would not be humiliated by Trudeau, not after everything he had accomplished, after the wars he had won in Washington, after proving time and again that he could bend the system to his will. No more talking, he finally said, his voice low, dangerous, final. We retaliate. The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking into every person seated around the table. This wasn't just a dispute anymore, it was war. Trump held up a hand, his expression shifting from raw anger to something far more controlled, far more dangerous, calculated resolve. No, that's what Trudeau expects. His voice dropped slightly, the tension in the room thickening as every advisor fell silent, watching, waiting for the next move. We're going to show them the art of the deal. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together, his eyes narrowing as the gears turned in his mind, calculating, strategizing. He had played this game before, had outmaneuvered CEOs, world leaders, and political adversaries alike, and Justin Trudeau was no different. Caroline, I want you to emphasize that America is self-sufficient, Trump said, his gaze locking onto his press secretary, who was already scribbling notes, formulating the message in real time. We have the resources, the innovation, the will to overcome this challenge. Highlight the advancements in renewable energy, the resurgence of American manufacturing, paint a picture of strength and resilience. He knew the media would try to spin this as an economic crisis, but if he got ahead of the narrative, if he framed it as a test of American ingenuity and determination, then Trudeau's move would backfire. Stephen, go find the deal that Trudeau is willing to accept, Trump continued, his tone shifting slightly, more methodical, more tactical. He wasn't backing down, but he wasn't going to play into Trudeau's hands either. We're not going to crush them, but we're going to teach them a lesson about respecting America and keeping their word. Miller, ever the strategist, nodded slowly, his mind already working through the scenarios, mapping out what leverage they had, what pressure points could be applied, where Trudeau might be forced to concede without making it look like a complete surrender. Trump wasn't just looking for a win. He was looking to reshape the dynamics of the relationship, to remind Canada and the world that America dictated the terms, not the other way around. Trudeau had tried to push back. Now it was time to push harder. Chapter 3. The olive branch days turned into weeks, filled with media firestorms, political maneuvering, and behind-the-scenes negotiations, each moment ratcheting up the pressure on Justin Trudeau as the weight of his decision began to crush him from all sides. Canadian businesses, once confident in their government's ability to stand firm, began to scream about lost contracts, disrupted supply chains, and evaporating profits. Consumers, once swayed by Trudeau's rhetoric, now faced skyrocketing prices on essential goods, their patience wearing thin. The political opposition in Canada smelled blood, their knives sharpened, ready to plunge into the Prime Minister's weakening grip on power, framing him as reckless, out of his depth, a leader who had gambled with the economy and lost. The public mood soured, and suddenly, the man who had tried to challenge Trump now found himself drowning in a crisis of his own making. Trump, meanwhile, remained a picture of calm confidence, his demeanor unchanged, unmoved by the chaos unfolding across the border. He watched, waited, measured his words carefully, never panicking, never breaking the image of a leader who was in complete control. He addressed the nation, standing before the American people with his characteristic certainty, promising solutions, resilience, and American ingenuity. His message was not one of division, but of strength, subtly reinforcing the idea that America did not need Canada, but Canada needed America. He spoke of industry, of energy independence, of the strength of American workers, reminding the world that no nation, not even its closest allies, could threaten the United States and expect to come out unscathed. And then, in a move that only added to his growing leverage, he allowed Trudeau to call him. The moment had arrived. The crisis had reached its breaking point. And now, Justin Trudeau, battered by political backlash, weighed down by the consequences of his own defiance, had no choice but to reach out. The phone call was tense, the air heavy with unspoken truths, but Trump, ever the deal-maker, was surprisingly conciliatory, his voice steady, composed, but unmistakably dominant. "I understand the situation you're in, Justin," Trump said, his tone measured, deliberate, the voice of a man who had already won the battle and was now merely watching his opponent realize it. "I never wanted to hurt Canada. All I wanted was a fair deal. But you need to understand, Justin, that threatening the United States will not work and expect to get favorable treatment. That isn't going to happen." The message was clear. Trudeau, cornered and desperate, finally understood. There was no fight left. There was no maneuvering out of this one. There was only one option left: capitulation, and Trump had orchestrated it perfectly. Chapter 4. The Apology. The press conference was short, somber, and humiliating for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, a man who had spent weeks posturing, defying, and escalating only to now stand before the cameras, visibly defeated, his words carefully chosen but heavy with forced contrition. The bright lights of the press room seemed harsher than usual, the rows of journalists watching intently, their pens poised, their cameras rolling, waiting to capture the precise moment of his public capitulation. Trudeau's jaw was tight, his shoulders stiff, the weight of political consequences pressing down on him as he finally spoke. "After careful consideration and discussions with President Trump," he began, his voice strained, his usual polished eloquence now cracking under the weight of what he was forced to say, "I have decided to reinstate the electricity surcharge to the United States." He paused, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard, the words clearly bitter on his tongue. But there was no other way out. He had miscalculated, and now he had to eat his words in front of the world. "I let my emotions get the best of me, and I deeply regret my prior actions," he continued, the humility in his tone ringing hollow, each syllable a painful concession to reality. The Canadian public had turned against him, the opposition had pounced, and now, here he was, forced to admit that Trump had outplayed him, that the gambit had failed, that Canada had no choice but to repair the damage. He took a shaky breath, gripping the podium as though it was the only thing keeping him standing. "I apologize to President Trump, to the American people, and to the Canadian people for the disruption and uncertainty caused by my actions." The words stung, and the pause that followed was excruciating. The silence filled with the weight of a prime minister being forced to bow before the very man he had tried to challenge. "I can assure everyone that Canada will work diligently to repair our relationship with the United States," he concluded, his eyes scanning the room, knowing full well that this moment would follow him for the rest of his political career. The once defiant leader, now reduced to an apologetic figure standing in the shadow of Trump's diplomatic victory, had sealed his fate. The reporters in the room knew it, his allies in government knew it, and most of all, Trudeau himself knew it. He had spent weeks attempting to frame himself as the champion of Canadian sovereignty, the leader who would not be intimidated by Trump's economic warfare, but reality had proven otherwise. The pressure had become unbearable. Canadian industries, once firmly behind him, had begun to turn, their anger fueled by the economic turmoil that followed his aggressive stance. Energy providers, manufacturers, and exporters, all suffering from the retaliatory policies and tariffs that Trump had put in place, had begun to openly question his leadership. The press, which had initially rallied behind his boldness, had started to turn skeptical, asking whether his tactics had been reckless rather than courageous. His approval ratings, which had already been slipping, plummeted further. Within his own party, Murmurs of discontent had begun to circulate, whispers of whether Trudeau's miscalculation had irreparably damaged Canada's economic position. Meanwhile, Trump had played the situation perfectly. He had allowed Trudeau to escalate, knowing that economic pressure and internal dissent would do most of the work for him. While Trudeau was struggling to maintain control over the crisis he had ignited, Trump remained composed, never showing signs of weakness or desperation. He addressed the American people with confidence, reassuring them that any disruptions in trade would be temporary, that his administration had contingency plans in place, and that the United States would always protect its economic interests. He allowed the media to speculate, to build the narrative that Trudeau had overplayed his hand. He made sure that every press conference, every interview, subtly reminded Americans that Canada needed the United States far more than the United States needed Canada. He did not rush to retaliate too quickly. He let Trudeau sweat, and when the time was right, he took Trudeau's call, knowing that it would be the final nail in the coffin of the Canadian Prime Minister's ill-fated gamble. When the call came, Trump had taken his time before answering. He had let Trudeau wait, let him feel the weight of the decision he was about to make. When he finally did pick up, he had not raised his voice, had not gloated. He had simply laid out the facts. "I understand the situation you're in, Justin," Trump had said, his voice steady, his tone measured. "I never wanted to hurt Canada. All I wanted was a fair deal. But you need to understand, Justin, that threatening the United States will not work, and expecting to get favorable treatment, that isn't going to happen." The message had been clear. Trudeau had no more cards left to play. His decision was made before the conversation even ended. And now, standing before the press, delivering his public concession, he was fully aware of what had just happened. This wasn't just about restoring the electricity surcharge. This wasn't just about patching up relations with the United States. This was about survival. The only way forward for Trudeau was damage control, an attempt to salvage what little credibility he had left. But even as he spoke, as he tried to sound statesmanlike, to frame this as a necessary decision rather than a capitulation, he knew it was futile. The headlines would tell the story for him. Trudeau backs down. Trump forces Canada to reverse course. Humiliation on the world stage. His opponents in Parliament would seize on the moment, using it as proof that Trudeau was weak, that he had gambled with the nation's economy and lost. The opposition leader had already begun crafting his response, calling for accountability, for an admission that Trudeau had made a mistake that Canada could not afford. The business community, still reeling from the economic uncertainty of the past weeks, was already shifting its support, questioning whether Trudeau's leadership could be trusted going forward. And Trump? Trump had won. Once again, he had outmaneuvered a world leader, proving that the United States did not bow to threats, that economic leverage was the most powerful tool in diplomacy, that in the grand chessboard of international politics, he was always 5 moves ahead. And he had done it without even breaking a sweat. As Trudeau stepped away from the podium, his expression carefully controlled but his shoulders slightly hunched as if bearing the weight of defeat, Trump watched the broadcast from the White House, a satisfied smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "I told you," he muttered, shaking his head. "They always come around." Around him, his staff chuckled, nodding in agreement. Another battle won, another leader brought to heel. The art of the deal, once again, had prevailed. Chapter 5. A Lesson Learned. In the White House, Trump watched the press conference on television, the screen casting a soft glow across the dimly lit room, his expression unreadable, his signature smirk playing at the corners of his lips. This was not just a victory. It was a confirmation of everything he had always believed about power, leverage, and negotiation. Trudeau had folded. He had been forced to walk back his defiance, to admit his miscalculation, to restore what he had taken away, all because Trump had refused to waver, had refused to be bullied into submission. The Prime Minister's voice, strained and careful, filled the room, his apology playing over the speakers, and Trump simply shook his head, amused at how predictable it all had been. He tapped his fingers against the armrest of his chair, exhaling slowly as he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had seen this happen before, who would see it happen again. "He learned his lesson," he murmured, his gaze never leaving the screen. "He came to respect the United States. You have to be strong to negotiate, even when you're dealing with friends." Standing beside him, Caroline Leavitt, ever the loyal press secretary, nodded approvingly, her eyes shining with admiration, knowing that this moment, like so many others before it, would define Trump's presidency. He had proven, once again, that strength dictated outcomes, that diplomacy was nothing without leverage. "You handled this masterfully, Mr. President," she said, her voice brimming with conviction, already mentally crafting the press statement that would frame this as a victory not just for Trump, but for America itself. Across the room, Stephen Miller, his sharp mind always focused on the bigger picture, the long-term implications, leaned slightly forward, his hands clasped together as he spoke, his tone measured, deliberate, laced with satisfaction. "This sends a clear message to all our allies. America expects to be treated with respect. The era of weakness is over." The words hung in the air, carrying the weight of finality, the truth that had been reaffirmed in front of the entire world. The scene shifted to the Oval Office, where Trump now sat behind the resolute desk, a gold-tipped pen in hand, signing executive orders, the formalities of governance continuing even in the wake of geopolitical victory. His movements were slow, thoughtful, and after a moment, he paused, setting the pen down, his fingers lacing together as he looked up, his expression more reflective now. The adrenaline of the battle had settled into something deeper, something more philosophical, more strategic. He didn't just see this as a win, he saw it as a lesson, a principle, a testament to how the world truly worked. The goal wasn't to punish Canada, he mused, his voice softer now but no less firm, no less certain. It was to restore balance and to remind everyone that strength and resolve are the cornerstones of any successful relationship. And as he sat there, the weight of another victory under his belt, the world watching, his advisors silent in recognition of the moment, Trump knew that this wasn't just about Canada or Trudeau or trade. It was about the precedent he had set, the message he had sent, and the power that came with never backing down. Epilogue. The electricity flowed once more across the border, a silent yet undeniable testament to Trump's victory, to the power of leverage, negotiation, and unwavering strength. The great game of geopolitics had played out, and as expected, the United States had emerged triumphant, not just in restoring trade, but in reshaping the dynamics of the relationship itself. The economic disruptions faded, but the lesson remained. America was not to be challenged without consequence. Trade resumed, though under a new, more equitable agreement, one that reflected Trump's central belief that alliances must be built on fairness, on strength, on mutual benefit, not on blind tradition or outdated diplomacy. Trudeau, once so defiant, had been humbled, forced to concede what he had once refused, a public admission of his miscalculation, a lesson learned the hard way. The crisis had passed, but its ripple effects continued, reshaping how world leaders viewed their dealings with the United States. No longer was America seen as a complacent superpower, bogged down by hesitation and bureaucratic inertia. It was once again seen as the indomitable force on the world stage, a nation led by a president who understood the art of the deal, who wielded power not as an abstract concept but as a tangible force, one that could be felt, one that commanded respect. This was not just a diplomatic skirmish. It was a reaffirmation of America's dominance, a clear signal to every nation, friend or foe, that Trump's America did not bow, did not yield, and did not tolerate weakness. And as the northern lights flickered once more across the sky, their brilliance stretching over the vast Canadian wilderness, they seemed to carry with them a message, a quiet but unmistakable reminder of the power of resilience, of leadership, of a nation that had momentarily dimmed but had now reignited. The crisis had been weathered, the lesson had been taught, and America stood unchallenged once again, its resolve shining as brightly as the auroras dancing above.